"Throw her out," the white CEO said without even looking up, and for one impossible second, the music, the laughter, and the clinking crystal glasses all seemed to disappear into silence. More than 300 guests filled the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Regency Hotel in downtown Chicago, where Whitmore Industries was hosting its annual shareholder appreciation gala. Chandeliers scattered warm golden light across polished marble floors, while tuxedos and designer gowns drifted between linen-covered tables decorated with white orchids and silver candle holders. Every smile in the room seemed carefully rehearsed. Every handshake carried the weight of money. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore, the 57-year-old CEO whose reputation for discipline had helped build a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing empire. His charcoal tuxedo fit perfectly, his silver cufflinks reflected the ballroom lights, and his expression rarely changed. Investors admired him. Employees feared him. Business magazines called him decisive. People who worked closely with him usually chose another word: unforgiving. About 20 feet away, Naomi Carter balanced a polished serving tray against one hand while carefully weaving between guests. At 28, she had learned how to become almost invisible during events like these. A quiet smile, careful steps, no unnecessary conversation. It was her third week working evening shifts for Lakeshore Hospitality, and every dollar mattered. During the day, she visited her mother at a long-term memory care facility on the city's south side, where mounting medical bills had slowly erased nearly every dollar Naomi had managed to save over the past 5 years. The overnight shifts were exhausting, but they paid better than the neighborhood diner where she had worked before. She never complained. She simply showed up early, worked hard, and went home. Most guests never noticed her face. They noticed empty glasses magically becoming full again, dirty plates quietly disappearing, wrinkled tablecloths suddenly straightened. That was the way service was supposed to work. Invisible. Until tonight. Naomi approached the executive table, carrying sparkling water requested moments earlier by several board advisors who had not yet arrived. As she reached the edge of the table, she noticed something unusual. A leather presentation folder lay partially open beside Richard Whitmore's place setting. A single page rested slightly outside the folder, almost as if someone had pulled it free before being interrupted. Naomi slowed for only a heartbeat. The signature page caught her attention, not because she intended to read confidential documents, but because one detail looked strangely familiar. The company seal printed near the bottom didn't match the embossed version she had briefly seen earlier that afternoon while delivering refreshments to a conference room upstairs. Before she could process the thought, a sharply dressed executive beside Richard suddenly turned, brushing her arm. A glass tipped sideways. Water splashed harmlessly across the edge of the linen tablecloth, stopping inches from the document. Naomi reacted instantly, setting down the tray and reaching for a folded cloth to keep the papers dry. She never even touched the contract. But Richard Whitmore finally looked directly at her, his blue eyes narrowing with unmistakable irritation. Around them, conversations faded one by one as dozens of guests instinctively turned toward the growing silence. Richard's jaw tightened. "Security," he said in a voice calm enough to be frightening. "Remove this waitress from my event. Now." Two uniformed security officers exchanged a quick glance before moving toward Naomi with the practiced restraint of men who had handled uncomfortable situations many times before. Neither of them appeared angry. Neither looked convinced she had done anything wrong. They simply followed instructions. Naomi lowered her eyes, picked up the folded linen cloth she had dropped, and carefully placed it back onto her serving tray. Her breathing remained steady even as dozens of unfamiliar faces watched her from every direction. Embarrassment had a strange weight. It settled quietly across her shoulders without making a sound. She could already imagine tomorrow morning. Another temporary employee dismissed before completing her first month. Another explanation she would have to give her supervisor. Another paycheck that would never arrive. Yet she did not argue. She did not plead. She simply nodded once. "I understand," she said softly. The taller security officer, Tom Reynolds, motioned politely toward the ballroom entrance. "This way, Mississippi." His voice carried respect that contrasted sharply with the tension filling the room. Naomi followed without protest, her black service shoes making almost no sound across the polished marble floor. As she walked past rows of elegantly dressed guests, Whispers spread like ripples across still water. Some people looked away, uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Others watched openly, curious to see how the scene would end. A few quietly assumed the waitress must have crossed a line they had not seen. That was how assumptions worked. They often arrived long before the truth did. Naomi had lived with that reality for most of her life. Growing up on the west side of Chicago, her grandmother used to remind her that dignity was something no one could hand you, and no one could truly take away unless you surrendered it yourself. Those words had stayed with her through every difficult season. They stayed with her now. Behind the ballroom doors, the sounds of the gala slowly returned. A jazz quartet resumed playing. Conversations restarted. Crystal glasses touched once again as though the interruption had never happened. Only Richard Whitmore remained unusually quiet. He straightened the edge of the leather presentation folder without opening it again, his attention already returning to the evening's schedule. In less than 15 minutes, the final documents for Whitmore Industries' largest international acquisition would be presented before several incoming board members arrived from a delayed flight. Everything had to proceed exactly on time. Precision had built his company. Precision left no room for unexpected voices. Outside the ballroom, the corridor felt noticeably cooler. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago River, where the last light of early evening reflected across the water like scattered silver. Tom slowed his pace. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, reading the name stitched onto her uniform. "I know this is difficult." Naomi offered a small smile that did not quite reach her tired eyes. "You are just doing your job." Tom hesitated before answering. "Sometimes I wish people remembered that everyone else is doing theirs too." Naomi glanced once through the tall glass doors toward the ballroom behind them. Her eyes settled for only a second on the leather folder still resting beside the chief executive's seat. Something about that signature page continued to bother her. She could not explain why. She only knew that the company seal she had glimpsed upstairs earlier that afternoon had looked different, and the memory refused to leave her mind. Tom stopped a few feet from the employee elevator instead of continuing toward the security office. He looked at Naomi for a long moment before speaking. "Stay here for just a minute," he said quietly. "I need to check with event management before I process anything." Naomi nodded without asking questions. The doors closed behind him, leaving her alone in the softly lit corridor. Evening sunlight poured through the towering windows overlooking the river, painting long bands of amber across the polished stone floor. Somewhere below, a sightseeing boat drifted beneath the bridge, its horn echoing faintly through the glass. The peaceful sound felt strangely disconnected from the tension still tightening her chest. Naomi rested her serving tray on a nearby console table and exhaled slowly. She closed her eyes for only a second, trying to settle the uneasy feeling she could not explain. It was not fear of losing another job. She had survived worse disappointments than that. It was the image of the presentation folder that refused to disappear. Earlier that afternoon, she had been assigned to deliver coffee and bottled water to a private conference room on the 34th floor. The meeting had ended abruptly after receiving word that several board members had been delayed because of severe weather outside Milwaukee. Executives hurried away, leaving folders scattered across the conference table while staff rushed to prepare the ballroom. Downstairs, Naomi had quietly gathered empty cups and folded napkins without paying attention to the paperwork until one binder slid toward the edge of the table. Instinctively, she caught it before it hit the floor. The cover briefly opened, exposing the company's official acquisition packet. She remembered noticing the embossed corporate seal because the raised silver emblem reflected directly beneath the ceiling lights. It had been clean, centered, and remarkably detailed. She closed the binder immediately without reading another page and placed it exactly where she found it. The moment lasted no more than 3 seconds. Yet the memory remained unusually clear. Downstairs in the ballroom, however, the seal beside the signature page had looked flatter, darker, and positioned slightly lower than she remembered. It was such a tiny difference that almost anyone would dismiss it. But Naomi had always noticed details other people overlooked. As a child, she could complete 1,000-piece puzzles faster than anyone in her neighborhood. Later, during community college, one accounting professor joked that she spotted inconsistencies the way musicians recognized familiar melodies. Life had forced her to leave school before graduation after her mother's diagnosis, replacing textbooks with double shifts and hospital visits. but her eye for patterns had never disappeared. Back inside the ballroom, Richard Whitmore stood near the stage reviewing tomorrow's market projections with his chief financial officer, Daniel Mercer. Daniel maintained the polished confidence expected of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder. His tailored navy suit looked flawless beneath the ballroom lights, and every sentence he spoke sounded carefully measured. "Everything is ready," Daniel assured him. "Once the board arrives, we can move directly to signatures." Richard gave a brief nod. Efficiency mattered more than celebration tonight. The acquisition would expand Whitmore Industries into 3 additional states and create headlines before the opening bell on Wall Street. Delays meant uncertainty. Uncertainty threatened investor confidence. Around them, senior executives exchanged optimistic smiles, believing the evening's biggest interruption had already been resolved. None of them noticed that Daniel's fingers lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary on the leather presentation folder before quietly sliding it closer to his chair. Tom returned a minute later with an apologetic expression that seemed heavier than before. "The event director wants you to wait until the board meeting begins," he said. "After that, human resources will decide what happens." Naomi simply nodded. "Thank you." Tom hesitated, then handed her a sealed bottle of water from a nearby service station. "It might be a while." She accepted it with a quiet smile. "That is very kind." As Tom walked back toward the ballroom, Naomi remained by the window, watching the reflection of city lights slowly appear across the river as evening settled over Chicago. She wanted to let the matter go. She truly did. A waitress was not expected to question executives. A temporary employee certainly was not expected to think about corporate documents. Yet the uneasy feeling refused to leave. Her eyes drifted toward the ballroom entrance again. The doors opened briefly as another server hurried inside, carrying fresh coffee. For only an instant, Naomi caught sight of the executive table. Daniel Mercer had opened the leather presentation folder, while Richard Whitmore answered questions from several investors nearby. Daniel quickly flipped through several pages before closing the folder again. The movement was smooth, almost rehearsed, but something about the sequence felt wrong. Naomi suddenly remembered one additional detail from the conference room upstairs. The original signature packet had included a blue verification ribbon attached through the upper left corner. The folder inside the ballroom did not. Her heartbeat quickened. She replayed the image again and again, testing her own memory. Was she mistaken? Had another version been printed? Or had something been replaced between the afternoon meeting and tonight's ceremony? She stared through the narrow opening before the ballroom doors closed once more. The thought would not let go. "Hey." Maintenance employee pushing a supply cart passed behind her. "Everything all right?" he asked casually. Naomi looked down for a moment before answering. "I hope so." Back inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted from celebration to anticipation. Several television crews positioned their cameras near the stage while shareholders gathered closer to the front. Richard glanced at his watch. "How much longer?" he asked. Daniel smiled confidently. "The board's flight landed 20 minutes ago. They should arrive any minute." Richard nodded, satisfied. "Good. Once they are seated, we finalize everything." Daniel adjusted his tie, but for the first time that evening, a tiny bead of perspiration appeared near his temple despite the cool air inside the ballroom. Outside, Naomi quietly stepped closer to the entrance. She knew speaking again could end whatever chance remained of keeping her job. She also knew remaining silent might allow something far more serious to happen. Her grandmother's voice echoed through her memory as clearly as if she were standing beside her. "Doing the right thing is rarely comfortable, Naomi. That is why so few people choose it." She closed her eyes briefly, took one slow breath, and straightened her shoulders. At that exact moment, the ballroom doors opened again as an event coordinator hurried toward the entrance to welcome the arriving board members. Naomi caught one final glimpse of the presentation folder resting beside Richard Whitmore's seat. This time she saw it clearly. The silver corporate seal was not merely different. It was printed instead of embossed. Before she could stop herself, the words escaped in a calm but unmistakably clear voice. "Sir, I do not think that is the original signature packet." Naomi's voice was never loud, but in the sudden silence outside the ballroom, it carried farther than she expected. Several guests nearest the entrance turned toward her at once. Inside, Richard Whitmore slowly lifted his head, his expression hardening before she had even finished speaking. Daniel Mercer froze for the smallest fraction of a second before forcing another composed smile. Richard stepped away from the executive table and walked toward the entrance with measured confidence, every polished shoe strike echoing across the marble floor. He stopped only a few feet from Naomi. His eyes held no curiosity, only irritation. "You again," he said evenly. "I thought I made myself perfectly clear." Naomi kept both hands folded in front of her. "Sir, I understand this is not my place, but I believe the document is different from the one that was prepared upstairs this afternoon." Richard gave a short, humorless laugh that caused several nearby executives to smile awkwardly. "Different," he repeated. "You were telling me that after serving drinks for 3 weeks, you suddenly became qualified to review confidential acquisition contracts." Naomi shook her head gently. "No, sir. I am only saying the company seal appears to have changed." Richard glanced briefly toward the leather folder before looking back at her. "That is enough." His voice remained controlled, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "You are a waitress. Your responsibility was serving guests, not inserting yourself into executive business." Several investors standing nearby quietly nodded in agreement. One woman whispered to her husband that temporary employees often tried to attract attention during high-profile events. Another guest casually raised a phone, apparently recording the confrontation from across the ballroom. Naomi noticed the device, but ignored it. She was not interested in defending herself. She only wanted someone to verify the documents before signatures were placed on the page. Tom Reynolds stepped forward cautiously, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir," he began, "perhaps someone could simply compare the packet with the conference room copy." Richard turned toward him immediately. "Are you questioning my judgment now?" Tom lowered his eyes. "No, sir." Richard faced Naomi once more. "This evening represents months of negotiations involving billions of dollars. We are not delaying this ceremony because a catering employee believes she remembers the texture of a company seal." Soft laughter spread through a few corners of the ballroom. Naomi felt the warmth rise into her face, but she remained remarkably calm. She looked directly at Richard without raising her voice. "Then it will only take a minute to prove I am mistaken." Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time that evening, something beyond annoyance crossed his face. It was pride challenged by someone he believed should never have spoken at all. "Escort Miss Carter completely off the property," he said firmly without taking his eyes off her. "She is not to re-enter this building." Tom hesitated again, his feet refusing to move immediately. The second security officer shifted uneasily beside him. Before either man could respond, the revolving doors at the front of the hotel lobby turned slowly, and a group of sharply dressed men and women entered together with quiet confidence. The event coordinator hurried forward, suddenly smiling with visible relief. "The board has arrived," she announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom. Every conversation stopped once again. No one moved. For several long seconds, the ballroom seemed suspended between one moment and the next, as though even time itself had decided to wait. The jazz quartet quietly lowered their instruments without being asked. Conversations dissolved into silence. Crystal glasses rested untouched on white linen tables. The only sound came from the faint hum of the hotel's air conditioning and the distant traffic drifting across the Chicago River beyond the towering windows. Naomi remained exactly where she stood, her serving tray still resting lightly against her side. She did not look toward the arriving guests. She did not look at Richard Whitmore. Instead, her eyes settled briefly on the polished marble floor, where hundreds of tiny reflections from the chandeliers shimmered beneath her shoes like scattered stars. She took one slow breath, then another. Losing this job would make tomorrow harder. Rent was due in 9 days. Her mother's next treatment invoice had arrived that morning. The numbers had been impossible to ignore. Yet strangely, those worries no longer occupied her mind. She kept thinking about the document. If she remained silent now, she might keep a little dignity by leaving quietly. But if she was right, remaining silent could cost people far more than a temporary position ever could. Her grandmother had often said that character revealed itself most clearly when nobody expected courage from you. Naomi had never forgotten those words. Across the ballroom, Richard adjusted the sleeve of his tailored tuxedo before straightening his posture. His expression remained composed for the benefit of investors, and cameras, now focused near the entrance. Public appearances mattered. Confidence mattered. Every movement projected certainty. Daniel Mercer quietly gathered the presentation folder from the table and held it against his chest with both hands. His smile returned, although it looked noticeably tighter than before. A thin line of perspiration glistened near his temple despite the cool temperature inside the ballroom. Tom Reynolds noticed it. He also noticed something else. Daniel had subtly shifted the folder so that the signature page faced inward, away from anyone standing nearby. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but once seen it became impossible to ignore. Tom glanced toward Naomi. She remained perfectly still, showing no satisfaction, no anger, no fear. Only patience. The revolving doors completed one final turn before coming to rest. 7 members of the Whitmore Industries board entered together, dressed in dark business suits and carrying the quiet confidence that came from decades of leadership. Their arrival changed the atmosphere immediately. Executives straightened their jackets. Investors stepped aside. Hotel staff respectfully cleared the entrance. At the center of the group walked Evelyn Brooks, the chairwoman of the board, whose calm presence commanded attention without a single raised word. Silver streaks framed her neatly styled hair, and her steady eyes missed very little. She smiled politely towards several shareholders before her gaze slowly traveled across the ballroom. It paused for only a heartbeat on Richard Whitmore. Then it shifted unexpectedly toward the entrance, where Naomi still stood beside the security officers. Evelyn's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not with surprise, but with quiet recognition, as though something before her did not match what she had expected to find. The ballroom remained silent. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Richard stepped forward to welcome the board with practiced confidence, unaware that the next few minutes would determine far more than the future of a single business deal. Evelyn Brooks did not return Richard Whitmore's welcoming smile. Instead, she continued walking until she stood only a few feet from the executive table, her measured footsteps echoing softly across the marble floor. The other board members spread out behind her with quiet discipline, each observing the unusual tension hanging over the ballroom. Richard extended his hand politely. "Madam Chair, welcome. We were just about to begin the signing ceremony." Evelyn acknowledged the greeting with a brief nod, but did not reach for his hand. Her attention shifted instead to the leather presentation folder Daniel Mercer still held against his chest. "Before we begin," she said calmly, "I would like to know why security is escorting someone away from this event." Richard answered without hesitation. A catering employee interrupted executive proceedings by questioning confidential documents. Evelyn looked toward Naomi. "Did you question the documents?" Naomi met her eyes respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." Richard immediately stepped in. "She believes the acquisition packet is different from the original draft prepared this afternoon." A few guests chuckled quietly, expecting the conversation to end there. Instead, Evelyn asked one more question. And why would she believe that? Naomi spoke carefully, never raising her voice. "Because the original packet I briefly saw upstairs had an embossed corporate seal with a blue verification ribbon. The folder on the table has a printed seal, and the ribbon is missing." Silence settled over the room once again. Evelyn slowly turned toward Daniel Mercer. "May I see the folder?" Daniel smiled politely, although the confidence in his expression had begun to fade. "Of course." He stepped forward and handed it to her with steady hands that concealed growing tension. Evelyn opened the folder without rushing. Several board members quietly moved closer, watching every page. She paused at the signature sheet, gently running her fingertips across the company seal. Then she looked up. "This is printed." No one answered. She turned one page backward, then another. Finally, she closed the folder halfway and looked directly at Daniel. "Where is the verification ribbon?" Daniel blinked once before replying. "The legal department must have prepared a clean copy for presentation." Evelyn remained expressionless. "Our legal department has never issued clean copies for board signatures. Every final acquisition packet is sealed with an embossed certification ribbon. That policy has existed for 14 years. Richard frowned for the first time. He reached toward the folder himself, examining the lower corner where the company seal appeared unnaturally flat beneath the ballroom lights. His eyes narrowed. "Daniel," he said quietly, "explain this." Daniel forced a nervous laugh. It is probably an administrative printing mistake. Evelyn looked toward another board member, an older attorney named Charles Bennett. Without saying a word, Charles opened a slim briefcase and removed an identical leather binder. "This," he said, placing it beside the first folder, "is the certified packet delivered directly from our legal archive before we left the airport." The differences were immediately visible. One folder carried a blue ribbon threaded through the corner with an embossed silver seal raised above the paper. The other did not. Even guests standing several feet away could see it. Richard stared from one document to the other as the realization slowly settled across his face. Naomi had been right. She had not interrupted the ceremony to embarrass him. She had tried to stop him from signing the wrong document. Richard turned toward Daniel, whose confident posture had disappeared completely. For the first time that evening, it was not the waitress standing alone beneath hundreds of watchful eyes. No one spoke. Hundreds of people remained frozen in place as the weight of the discovery settled across the ballroom. Richard Whitmore continued staring at the two nearly identical folders lying side by side on the polished table. Only now did he notice details that should have been obvious from the beginning. The paper stock was slightly different. The printed seal lacked the raised texture every certified document carried. Even the margins were narrower by less than 1/8 of an inch. Tiny differences. Expensive differences. He slowly looked toward Daniel Mercer. "How did this happen?" he asked quietly. Daniel swallowed before attempting another explanation. "There has to be some misunderstanding. Someone in legal must have." Evelyn Brooks gently raised one hand, stopping him before he finished. "There will be plenty of time for explanations after our internal audit team reviews every version of these documents." Her voice remained calm, but it carried an authority that immediately ended every excuse before it could begin. Another board member carefully collected both folders and placed them into separate evidence envelopes brought by the corporate legal department. Richard watched the process without saying a word. The acquisition ceremony had quietly transformed into something entirely different. Cameras that had arrived expecting photographs of a historic business announcement now captured executives standing in complete silence. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. The confidence that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier had vanished. Evelyn finally turned toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," she said warmly, "thank you for speaking when it would have been much easier to remain silent." Naomi lowered her eyes respectfully. "I only hoped someone would check before signing. Most people would have walked away after being dismissed," Evelyn replied. "You stayed because you believed protecting the truth mattered more than protecting yourself." Naomi answered honestly. "My grandmother taught me that integrity only has value when it costs you something." Several board members quietly nodded. Even Tom Reynolds smiled to himself. Richard remained motionless. Those simple words reached him more deeply than any criticism could have. He replayed the evening in his mind, remembering how quickly he had judged Naomi before asking a single question, how confidently he had dismissed her because of her uniform instead of listening to her observation. For years he had believed leadership meant making fast decisions. Tonight he realized that real leadership also required the humility to hear uncomfortable voices. He slowly walked toward Naomi until only a few feet separated them. The ballroom became silent once again. Richard took a slow breath before speaking. "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology." The words sounded unfamiliar coming from a man who rarely admitted mistakes. "I judged you by your position instead of your character. I assumed your voice had no place in this room, and because of that, I nearly made a decision that could have harmed this company and everyone who depends on it." Naomi looked at him with quiet kindness rather than satisfaction. "Everyone makes mistakes," she said softly. "What matters is what we choose after we recognize them." Richard nodded, absorbing every word. Evelyn glanced toward the other board members before speaking again. "Miss Carter, Whitmore Industries has leadership development programs designed to identify people with exceptional judgment and integrity. Tonight you demonstrated both without seeking recognition. If you are willing, I would like to invite you to meet with us after this matter is resolved to discuss opportunities beyond serving tables." Naomi stood speechless for a brief moment before offering the same humble smile she had carried throughout the evening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I would be honored to have that conversation." 1 year later, The first light of an early autumn morning spilled across the glass walls of Whitmore Industries headquarters, painting long ribbons of gold over the quiet plaza outside. Chicago was beginning another busy workday. Commuters crossed the sidewalks carrying coffee cups, buses rolled steadily along Michigan Avenue, and the city moved with the familiar rhythm of people chasing another day of opportunity. A black sedan stopped at the front entrance, and Naomi Carter stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a tailored navy business suit and carrying a simple leather portfolio instead of a serving tray. She paused for a brief moment, looking up at the same building she had once been escorted out of with nothing but quiet dignity. The revolving doors reflected the morning sunlight just as they had on that unforgettable evening, but everything else felt different. Tom Reynolds, still serving as chief of corporate security, recognized her immediately. A warm smile crossed his face before he reached for the glass door himself. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said. "Welcome back." Naomi smiled with the same gentle kindness that had never changed. "Thank you, Tom. It is good to see you again." As she entered the lobby, several employees greeted her by name. During the previous year, she had completed Whitmore Industries' Executive Leadership Development Program with remarkable distinction, earning the respect of people who had once known nothing about her except the uniform she wore. Her ability to notice details, ask thoughtful questions, and treat every employee with equal respect had become one of the company's greatest strengths. She never forgot the long nights serving tables or the difficult months balancing work with caring for her mother. Those experiences shaped every decision she now made. Upstairs, the executive conference room overlooked the Chicago skyline. Evelyn Brooks stood beside the windows reviewing the agenda for the morning board meeting before greeting Naomi with a proud smile. "Ready?" she asked. Naomi nodded. More than ever. A few moments later, Richard Whitmore entered the room carrying a notebook instead of the confidence that had once made him believe he always had the right answers. The board had renewed his position after extensive reforms, not because he had been perfect, but because he had accepted responsibility and worked tirelessly to rebuild a culture where every voice deserved to be heard. He stopped beside Naomi before taking his seat. "I still think about that night," he admitted quietly. Naomi looked at him with calm understanding. "So do I." Richard smiled gently. "It changed this company." Naomi answered with a simple truth. "It changed all of us." The meeting began, but something inside the room had become far more valuable than another successful acquisition or another profitable quarter. Respect no longer depended on a title, a salary, or the clothes someone wore to work. Ideas were measured by their honesty. Character mattered as much as credentials. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher above the city, filling the conference room with warm light that reflected across the polished table, where every seat carried equal importance. No applause followed. No dramatic speeches were needed. Only quiet conversations, open minds, and people finally listening before judging. Naomi glanced once through the glass toward the streets below, remembering the frightened waitress who had stood alone with nothing except the courage to tell the truth. She smiled softly, closed her portfolio, and joined the discussion as sunlight continued to pour across the room, leaving behind nothing except the peaceful silence that always follows genuine justice.